thanks for coming along. Apologies, as I say, for the queues outside for security. Someone cursing me. Okay. Just to go through, for those people who weren't here at the last one of these that we did, just to very quickly, for the background to all this, is that post the election, after we'd got through an element of mourning, to be honest, all pretty devastated, a number of us just talking about where do we go from here. We wanted to try and have a discussion about where the Labour Party goes next on some of the big issues that we need to face, away from the sort of the rough and tumble of the leadership election, let that get on and inevitably work itself through. But we thought what we'd try and do is create a space where we could have a discussion about a number of issues about where we go from here, learning some of the lessons of what's happened in the recent past as well. So we had a couple of weeks ago a discussion around one of the issues that's been part of the debate, I suppose, around the leadership of that, around public ownership. Part of that was about actually explaining what our policy was on public ownership, where it goes from here as well, and making sure that there isn't much of a retreat from that debate. It's all about controlling the economy. This discussion is one, I think, that never really took place when it should have done over recent years effectively, and that's about how we democratise our society. And I don't think it really, if you look back on the last 4 or 5 years, we didn't really have this debate in earnest properly. And then we've got subsequent ones on, one of them is around universal basic services. I wish we could find a different expression for that. Then also just about Greg Feiler and Ken Loach and others about communication and how we achieve hegemony around our ideas. And it's just to have an open discussion with a number of speakers and then open discussion, etc., from the floor. Okay? All right. No one's here under false pretenses. Okay, good, all right. You never know in this place. Someone could be in from the Automobile Association at the wrong meeting. So the title of this is How Do We Democratise Our Society? And the question that was put was, what does constitutional reform look like, and how do we move forward? So it's been a key issue. It's been a key issue with regard to about what's happened in terms of Scotland and Wales and Ireland now, which is remarkable. Might be a place of refuge I might need at some stage. But also in terms of the Brexit debate and issues around democratisation and control, etc., and the discussions that have been taking place around maybe a federal constitution for the future. So we've got a range of speakers. The speakers said no other questions, etc. Our first speaker, I'll read the blurb, all right? You can sue later, Paul, all right? Paul's a journalist, author, democracy activist who's campaigning with others for a citizens-led convention on the Constitution. His books include Unmasking the State, Time's Up for Neoliberalism, and A World to Win. World to Win is superb, and the others. He is a website editor for the Real Democracy Movement, that's helping to create a citizens' assembly on South Tyneside at the moment. And I've been appearing at some of the people's conventions that Paul's been organising, and they've been incredibly creative and vibrant in the discussions and the debate. And again, it's provided a space in which we can have these discussions more effectively, I think. Paul.
Okay, I'm going to speak for 2 hours, I mean for 10 minutes, on the state of constitution and democracy. If I can do that in 10 minutes, yeah, absolutely. So in 2016, you all remember 2016, interesting year, a letter I helped draft and organise appeared in The Guardian. And it said, the EU referendum, a couple of days after the result, has raised important questions about where power lies and where it should lie, which will be seriously addressed without creating an independent process for change. That's very important. We referred to social disquiet, which had at its heart our uncodified and somewhat mysterious constitution, whose essential features date back to the late 18th century. And it said it added a citizen-led process could refound the UK on the democratic principle of popular sovereignty, as opposed to parliamentary sovereignty. So, on the principle of popular sovereignty, where power truly does rest with the people. So, we're not talking about parliamentary sovereignty, and hence we're about popular sovereignty, and decisions are made in the public interest. Okay, you think that's great, but how do we get there? So almost 4 years on, 2020, Brexit has taken place, Britain's left the EU anyway, and a great constitutional change has just taken place. Almost unnoticed. Britain's relationship with an external body, the European Union, has changed. Constitutional relationship where their EU laws were higher than UK laws, all these kinds of things will change in a flash. The Constitution was changed, so don't think constitutions don't change. Now I would argue that it's more important than ever that following this Brexit and following what happened in December, that we take this campaign for a convention forward. Let's not forget the Tories are setting up a constitutional commission and they're proposing some very drastic constitutional changes themselves. So there is something going on out there and we have to get involved in it. The idea of the letter was to get support for a convention in the shape of pledges to implement its findings. So this proved a cul-de-sac. I mean, I've skipped a paragraph here. We set up a year or two ago something called Remaking Democracy Alliance, which set out to campaign for a convention and to discuss how those findings of that convention would actually be implemented, which is a big question which has not yet been resolved. But I'll come back to that. So I think the apparently dry subject of the Constitution is crucial to the future of the Labour Party. And all those who want a different, caring, not-for-profit society based on self-determination, where in face of competition, and where the destructive exploitation of nature is a thing of the past. It is actually central to that aspiration, absolutely central. So, and it's essential for every citizen, or should I say subject of the Crown, we all are here, not citizens. We want to become citizens, but we're not yet citizens, we're still subjects of the Crown. So, what is the Constitution? I know others are going to talk about this, so I'm going to give you, I haven't got a huge amount of time to talk about that. Constitutions organize, distribute, and regulate state power. That's the UCL Constitutional Union. That's not me. This is the generally accepted notion of the Constitution. It regulates and organizes the distribution of state power, the major state institutions, and the principles governing the relationship between all these institutions. And we're not just talking Parliament or the executive, we're talking the judiciary, the police service, the intelligence services, the military, and of course the Crown. All these institutions, together with the departments of state, constitute the state, these ensemble of institutions. So it follows, if you want to change the state and create new democratic institutions of power, you have to change the Constitution. It does follow. So we have to go deeper, I think a little deeper, because the people who write about this, very few of them say, so what is this Constitution? What's its purpose here? What's its actual raison d'etre? What's this Constitution for? What's its relation to social and economic development? Its purpose. So nowhere in the statutes, the conventions, and the traditions that make up the British Constitution is this stated. What is the state for? It's not stated anywhere, even in a general sense, say like the US Constitution states. So I think to find out more, we have to go and look at the historical development of this particular British state, the UK state, to see how it was formed in the heat of industrialization, the emergence of capitalism, and to see how this state and its institutions developed into this modern form that it takes in relation to that. And then we can see what the problem is, I think, a bit more. So, of course, the conditions for this development, as I'm sure you're all aware, were created by a turbulent 17th century, which included the Civil War, a glorious revolution, and Parliament deciding who would then succeed as monarch. This was the background to what happened later. So, just a couple of references here to academics. How long have I got? 5 minutes. So, Graham Gills, an Australian academic and theorist on the state, he says state power in the UK was dependent upon sustained cooperation with major economic actors. And this power was enhanced much more by cooperation than by direction of these actors. And it's very important to keep that thought in mind. So here we have the emergence, and I think this is one of our conundrums, of a division of labour. Not an Adam Smith division of labour, but a kind of state division of labour between the economic actors and the political actors. On the one side, you have the economic actors and the powerful, now transnational corporations, and on the other side, a state and political actors. But they are interdependent, they have relative autonomy. The state, the economic actors do not do education or build roads unless under the direction of the political side of this relationship. But there is an issue here. Political power and economic power are not the same things, and they can't be necessarily identified through looking at the state. So this division of labour, I think, is something we have to begin to overcome. In my view, and in the view of people like Bob Jessup, who's the eminent professor of sociology at Lancaster University, he comes to the conclusion that this is a capitalist type of state, not an independent state, not a state which is an arbiter between interests, but is partisan. It by its very nature is partisan. We can have a discussion how that sort of manifests itself later. So the question is, what's this got to do with the Convention on the Constitution? If we want to change the Constitution, who is going to change the Constitution? Or is it to be left to Parliament to change the Constitution in a way that favours the status quo? That is one option. This is what the Tories are planning and others have done. So I think we, the movement, has to champion the idea of a new constitution, not just a reform of the constitution, but a new democratic constitution fit for the 21st century that has at its heart the sovereignty of the people. That's got to be at the heart of the constitution, the sovereignty of the people. And we have to accept that representative democracy is but a stage in the evolution and the struggle for democracy. It's not the final word. We can't accept it as the final word. So we have to investigate more direct, deliberative forms of democracy too. So how could a convention work, and what would it address? Well, it can't be that we give it an agenda to address. We have to ask it to consider the problems of democracy and the absence of democracy or the breakdown of democracy. We have to ask it to consider extending democracy into the workplace, for example, where it isn't at the moment, where employers remain, the wage labour contract is sanctified by the state, where employers can sack people at will, and close plants at will, and keep surpluses from production at will. That needs to be investigated. So finally, how could a convention work? And what would its results be, and how could they be implemented? First of all, it has to be citizens-led. Citizens-led. That means it has to be made up of people chosen through sortition, whatever basis, who are represented across a section of society throughout the different parts of the United Kingdom, gender balance, and balance in all sorts of ways, but citizens, and they're asked to build on what we have achieved so far in the struggle for democracy, and to address the democratization of economic power as well as political power. So it would be comprised of citizens only. It would reflect our diverse communities. It would have to be transparent and non-partisan. It would be able to call witnesses and ask for submissions. It would be independent of political parties and of the political system, absolutely independent. And we would encourage political parties and other civil society organisations to participate through submissions and arguments within the convention, and to encourage membership, their members of the Labour Party and other organisations to engage in this process. And then the convention would have to be tasked, and this is where I would end, because I think I've just about run out of time. How are these proposals to be implemented? This is a very big question. Is it to be that we ask the Parliament to implement these proposals? And if Parliament says no, what do we do then? So it has to be a movement. It's not just a convention, it has to be supported by a movement of people for democratic change. And then we have to, in that struggle, how it is implemented will have to be all elaborated. There's no answers to this. New constitutions often come in a period of great turmoil and upheaval. And I think, that's the sort of situation we're in. And I think for Labour to champion this process and it will put it firmly on the side of the disenfranchised, powerless majority. That was an issue at the last election, And this could now be a way, one way, of changing that relationship. So thanks a lot.
Our next speaker is Pauline Bryan. Let me lead the book. Pauline's a member of the Scottish Labour Party, member of the Scottish Campaign for Socialism. She's a founder and member of the Red Paper Collective, which was formed in 2011 to consider a socialist response to the demands for Scottish independence. She's the co-editor of Class National and Socialism, the Red Paper on Scotland 2014, editor of 2 books on Keir Harvey's, relevant to the present day. She was appointed, well, she wasn't appointed, she was kidnapped and forced to join the House of Lords by us on the commitment that she would contribute to its abolition. She's been working with Jeremy and Richard Leonard on the constitutional issues throughout that period.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm not even going to begin to explain myself to you as how I've ended up in the House of Lords, and if I can't get abolished very quickly, I need to get back to Scotland. Both, as Paul was saying, the Labour and Tory parties made commitments to reviewing the Constitution in their manifesto last year. Labour to a constitutional convention and Tories to a constitutional commission. You might think from that that there was a degree of consensus around on the issue, but I think we'll find it's actually very different.
Excuse me, I can't actually hear.
Right, do I need, is this better? Okay, sorry. I think we've got to understand that constitutions are not neutral. They're written or changed by a party in power for the purposes of embedding their view of how they see the society developing. Things that they can embed at a point when they have the power to do it. And such tenets might shape the direction of the state. For example, when countries are acceding to the EU, they have to write into their overwhelmingly written constitutions that the state will guarantee a social market economy. So that's the sort of example for how the nature of the society can be framed by the Constitution. If Labour had been instituting constitutional change under a Corbyn government, I'm sure it would have tried to embed workers' rights, environmental protection, and the redistribution of wealth. The Tories, on the other hand, will be seeking to curtail the power of the judiciary and strengthen the executive over the legislature. Whatever the Tories do, I think it's essential, as Paul was saying, to develop its own thinking on these issues and to involve its members considering the implications for our socialist programme, then with a view to taking it out, and if there are citizens' assemblies and other means for promoting those ideas. I think today some people will still yawn and say, oh, all very interesting, but not a priority. But I want to make the case of why it is a priority, in particular, I would argue, for Scotland. We've actually got an election next year, and we've got to have a response to what I consider the divisive forces of Scottish nationalism and of British unionism. And this has got to be done before an election in May next year. I would also say, in echoing Paul, that it's urgent for Labour in England to have something to say to people who think their voices were not listened to over the past few years. So I don't think we can wait until Labour's back in power before we develop our ideas about whether we need to change our constitution and what those changes could be. The starting point for discussion shouldn't be about structures or voting methods, but instead we should be asking what it is we want to achieve, and then go back and look at the structures that would help bring that about. When we voted 20 years ago for a Scottish Parliament with tax-varying powers, expectations were high. The demand for devolution had been framed on the basis that Scotland was to the left of the rest of the UK and would deliver a workers' parliament. By 1997, even those on the right of the Labour Party, some not too far from here up the corridor, believed that the Scottish Parliament would be a socialist parliament. Despite the early optimism and it being described now as one of the most powerful devolved institutions in the world, it's failed to deliver. Part of the reason, I have to say, was the founding of it by Tony Blair, who had a determination to prevent some of the left-leaning MPs becoming members of a new Scottish Parliament. Perhaps on the basis that they might actually go on to develop an alternative version of Labour to the one New Labour was putting forward. I actually think you probably needn't have worried too much, knowing the Labour Party in Scotland at the time. We were the first local party to adopt his new Cause 4, for example. But it also was a result of the voting system which had been proposed by the Scottish Constitutional Convention in the 80s. It was intended to stop one party from having an overall majority and to promote a more consensual approach to politics. And I think that's an example of putting constitutional structures before political purpose. So whether under a Labour-Lib Dem coalition or the SNP, even when it had an overall majority, the Parliament has failed to tackle Scotland's great social and economic ills, including widespread poverty, inequality, deep-rooted and persistent health inequalities, housing shortage, and the loss of its industrial and service sectors to closures or takeover. When it became clear in 2011 that there was going to be a referendum on independence, a group of Labour Party and Communist Party members, including actually the policy officers of the three big trade unions, came together to promote a new red paper on Scotland. The group did extensive work on how the Scottish Parliament worked, what it had achieved, and how the Scottish economy was changing. And through that process, it arrived at core criteria to evaluate the arguments for independence coming from the SNP and the wider Left in the Yes campaign, the defence of the union coming from Better Together and the rights in the Labour Party across the Lib Dems and the Tories. And also to ask whether the Scottish Parliament in its current state was capable of working to the advantage of working people. The three priorities that the group outlined was enabling the redistribution of wealth and power across the nations and regions of the UK, democratising our economy through public ownership, fair procurement, and democratically accountable national investment, and creating both subsidiarity and solidarity, devolving powers to the most appropriate level for accountability, while building cooperation and solidarity rather than competition and rivalry. Almost every significant change in our constitution has come about as a quick fix response to political pressure. The Scottish Parliament, the Metro Mayors, police commissioners, the additional powers that were promised in the vow, English votes for English laws, all came about as a, oh God, we've got to deal with this, what shall we do, response. Many of the powers devolved in 1999 covered areas that could not actually be dealt with in isolation within one Scottish Parliament. Agriculture, fisheries, environment, food standards, all those sorts of issues. The only way they could actually devolve them entirely was because they were actually covered by EU regulations, which ensured the common standards across the devolved administrations of England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. If the UK had not been in the EU at the time, I think there would have most certainly been a move towards some form of federal arrangement, agreeing common standards and allowing for a single market. At the end of the year, we might well be faced with just that situation. So the present, this presents, I believe, problems but also some opportunities. Jeremy Corbyn and Richard Leonard, as John pointed out, asked if I would do some work in this area, and I've had the great privilege and benefit of working with Sean Griffin, who's over there in the corner somewhere, and Tommy Kane. We hope that the results, when they become available, will contribute to a wide debate within the party and beyond. But as I said earlier, there is a greater urgency for Scotland, and the Red Paper Collective hopes that the party will adopt a radical manifesto for change based on making the Scottish Parliament a people's parliament, more like the ideas of the pioneers of 50 years ago. There are still a few powers that could be devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and we will be asking for these to come. Example would be borrowing powers, the power to issue bonds for both resource and capital spending. What we say is borrowing powers actually fit for a parliament. This would allow public investment, particularly in renewables, giving the Scottish people ownership of these vital manufacturing companies. Labour could propose that powers on employment law and industrial relations are devolved, but on the basis that standards could not be lower than in the rest of the UK. That is important because we have had to deal with the possibility of airport duties being lower in Scotland than the rest of the UK. It was withdrawn, and in Ireland and Scotland, the possibility of business taxes being lower than the rest of the UK. So I think the point of having a common minimum standard that can only be enhanced across these issues. We have powers for things like welfare benefits that are not yet being used, but hopefully they will be, again, to enhance and mitigate, not to ever go below. So once these powers, if we were to achieve them, are delivered, perhaps with power of dealing with problems of drug abuse, which currently Scotland cannot go its own way on, some aspects of immigration, a question which is not universally agreed about employment law and industrial relations. That really does begin to bring us to the end of the road for new powers. So then what we've got to do is to look at the intergovernmental and interparliamentary arrangements that are a disadvantage both to Scotland, Wales, and I think now Northern Ireland will also join that. When the UK government acts as both a participant in negotiations, but also arbiter when there is any disagreement. Even after 20 years of devolved government, the British state is still one of the most centralised constitutions and imbalanced economies in the developed world. We need to break up the centralisation of wealth and power and share it not only between the nations of the UK, but also with the regions of England. Before we let Boris Johnson claim the idea of changing the House of Lords and making it his own, Labour must make a clear statement of support for progressive federalism and replacing the House of Lords with an elected Senate of the nations and regions. While there's still much work to be done on the role and composition of such a Senate, it could, I believe, be the basis of constitutional change that does allow for the redistribution of wealth and power, that makes our economy democratically accountable and delivers both subsidiarity and solidarity. And I hope the new Labour leadership team will be making this a priority in their work.
Okay, our final speaker is Paul O'Connell. Paul's a reader in law at Socialist, where he teaches UK public law. Prior to that, he was a reader in law at the University of Leicester and a lecturer in law at the National University of Ireland in Galway. Paul's published articles on the impact of globalisation on human rights, comparative protection of socio-economic rights, and the constitutional architecture of the EU. He is currently working on a project which critically interrogates the political economy and human rights in the contemporary global order, and editing the Elgar Handbook on Law and Marxism. Paul.
Thanks very much, John. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. So thanks to John and Madeline and everybody for the invitation here today. I normally do about a 2-hour lecture with students, introducing public law, telling them what the course is about before we start the course. So in 10 minutes, I'll try and say as much as I can about the relationship between socialism, democracy, and constitutional reform. I'll start off by saying that I echo much of what has been said by both Paul and Pauline, and think that both of them have sketched some interesting and certainly worthwhile avenues that the Labour Party and the broader left should pursue. What I want to do is slightly different. So what I want to sketch in the time I have is slightly different. Rather than talking about potential specific reforms that Labour or indeed the broader left should be engaged in and focused on, I want to make an argument for a particular orientation towards democracy and towards constitutional reform, a specifically socialist orientation towards democracy and constitutional reform. So again, any one of those terms, socialism, democracy, constitutional reform, is a 4-hour discussion just to scratch the surface. So I'll try as quickly as I can to get through it. To begin with socialism, of course, socialism is one of these inherently contested terms. Lots of people claim to be socialists, some with more legitimacy than others, but it's a term that is in the ether, has various different traditions in it. So I think a first step we have to take before we start talking about specific desirable constitutional reforms is to clarify our understanding of socialism and to clarify our understanding of transformative socialism in the 21st century. And in order to do that, I think we have to draw on what's best in the socialist tradition. And what's best in the socialist tradition, and what's the very heart of the socialist tradition, is the self-emancipation of the working class. It's almost trite, but it's such an important principle that it has to be restated, and it has to come back to the centre of our politics, of our analysis, and of our discussions. And it's not some moralistic paean to the masses. The idea of the self-emancipation of the working class is born out of a detailed, complex and concrete understanding of the nature of capitalism, of the nature of this system and how it reproduces itself, of the role that the working class play in that system, and an understanding that only the working class can transform society. Only the working class can lead us to a world in which climate catastrophe isn't our inevitable fate, a world in which egalitarianism is more than a vacuous aspiration. So the centrality of working class agency and working class empowerment has to inform how we think about socialism. That then moves us on to how we think about state power and constitutional reform. I want to say, again, I agree with some of what Paul said, but I definitely have reservations about some of the proposals. I think that a socialist orientation towards democracy and constitutional reform is very different from a traditional liberal orientation towards constitutional reform and democracy. And if we understand constitutions broadly understood in a generic sense, constitutions and constitutionalism, as we've inherited it, are a product of the bourgeois revolutions of the late 18th, early 19th century. They reflect particular class interests, particular ideas of the nature of society, the idea of restraining the state, holding back the state, generic ideas of popular sovereignty and the will of the people, which efface class differences, class conflict, and those other characteristics that we as socialists understand to be central defining factors of the societies in which we live. So the first point I'd say is that we need to understand where we're coming from, what our starting point is, and how we think about socialism and socialist transformation before we then engage in these debates about democracy and constitutional reform. If we accept then that a starting point for a socialist understanding is the empowerment of working class communities, allowing and facilitating working class communities through their daily activity to gain the confidence to fundamentally transform society, that then will mean that for us, I think, the question of whether or not we have a written constitution is far less important. Whether or not we have a different form of electoral first past the post versus proportional representation will matter a lot less, because these are questions which are important and play a role in generic discussions of democracy, but are less important if your fundamental focus is transforming society in a socialist direction, transforming society in a way which empowers working class people. And I say this having been born and grown up in the Republic of Ireland and having taught law in the Republic and taught law over here. I've had the experience of living under both a codified written constitution and the experience of living under the British Constitution. And the form of the Constitution has far less impact on the substance of the politics in these countries than we can sometimes imagine. So I'd say we need to be careful about fetishizing legal forms. And I say that as somebody who for a living teaches law, so I don't say it lightly. We need to be very careful about fetishizing legal forms. The fundamental deciding factor in what role a particular legal form plays is the broader constellation of social forces, the broader balance of powers, the respective powers of labour versus capital and so forth. So if we start from the idea that empowering working class people is the core of socialism, that's our starting point. Where does that bring us to on the question of state power and democracy, and also the question of constitutional reform? I would just say again, Paul, we have a fantastic outline of the nature of state power and so forth. I'd say that state power is probably even broader than what Paul sketched. Certainly in the recent elections, the role the BBC played and the media more generally is an aspect of state power, what Althusser would have called ideological state apparatuses. So there's more than the specific institutions of the state, which of course are important and have to form a central object of our concern, but state power is much more complex. Now, if we're part of a movement, if we're part of a broad left and also in the Labour Party who want to fundamentally transform society so as to empower working class communities, which means then transforming the relationships of ownership and so forth, we are going to be confronted, as everybody learned recently in the elections and other people have learned time and time again in the past, by state power in its different forms. So we then enter this interesting bind that socialists have confronted for the last 200 years of requiring the aspects of state power, requiring a transformed and activist state in order to implement the sort of green industrial revolution we want to see, in order to implement the sort of labour reforms we want to see, in order to reach a compromise around federalism which we want to see. That requires a strong state. At the same time, we have to find ways of deconstructing the state. In a famous old slogan, which some of you will be familiar with, we have to be in and against the state, and Pauline in the House of Lords probably demonstrates that more aptly than anyone else in the room at the moment. So we have to find ways of prefiguring forms of power which go beyond the existing state, while also, as best we can, harnessing the extant state structures, because we can't just step outside it. We can't wish up an alternative model and embrace that. We have to work with what we have, but we also have to prefigure the alternative we wish to see. So in that regard, I don't know how I'm doing for time.
You're all right, don't worry.
Yeah? Okay. So in that regard, I want to say that for socialists and for the broader left, when thinking about constitutions, when thinking about democracy, when thinking about state power, We need a theory of democracy and a theory of power which is adequate to the complexity of the state in the 24th century. So an awful lot of the language we use around separation of powers, bills of rights and so forth is inherited from an earlier period in time. The state has become markedly more complex, markedly more enmeshed in people's lives, and markedly more diverse. So we need to think about forms of power that are adequate to the current actually existing capitalist state. As Paul said, the state is absolutely a capitalist state. And in that sense, that's an important point for us to bear in mind as well. We can't simply, as socialists, lay hold of the state and use it to pursue the program we want to pursue, because that's not how state power works. Paul again made this point, and many other commentators have said it for years. The state isn't neutral on these issues. The state performs a specific role, and state power performs a specific role in sustaining the capitalist mode of production and the capitalist system of social relations. We can't simply lay hold of that and use it to abolish the existing state. We have to prefigure the alternative to that here and now. And just on that last point then, we've seen some of the green shoots of this already. Modest, halting, limited, but nonetheless promising. If we look at community wealth building in Preston, for example, if we look outside the UK at participatory budgeting, which was pioneered in Porto Alegre by the Workers' Party in Brazil, if we look at expanding and re-empowering local government, if we look at the sort of municipalism which is being tried out in Spain and elsewhere, the socialist left, the radical left, the left which is concerned with fundamentally transforming society, has to turn its focus to these avenues of struggle. It's important, and we definitely should abolish the House of Lords, particularly with some of the recent appointments. We should absolutely abolish the House of Lords. We should definitely fight the Tories tooth and nail when they attack civil liberties and human rights. We should do all of these things. But if that becomes our primary focus, we lose sight of the bigger transformative agenda which we as socialists should be committed to. So then, I'll just say on the UK Constitution, a couple of points to wrap it up. Historically, the British Labour Party and the Socialist left was quite comfortable with the British constitutional system. Whether you go back to Harold Lasky, John Griffiths, any number of people. It was really only in a period of defeat that the left turned to liberal constitutionalism as a defence against the right. And so as Thatcher was in ascendant, as the left was in decline, we looked at ways of possibly constraining the right within legal frameworks and so forth. If we learn any lesson from the last 30 years, we should learn that written constitutions have done very little anywhere in the world to constrain the right, to limit capital, or to advance the interests of working class people. One concrete example, and perhaps one of the saddest ones, is South Africa. After the abolition of apartheid, a triumphant and a hopeful era, South Africa adopted one of the most advanced constitutions we've ever seen, including socio-economic rights, multi-racial and sort of multinational understandings of power and so forth. South Africa since then is more unequal than it was under apartheid South Africa. The ANC exercises a stranglehold over the government with an extremely powerful executive, which again is a global trend. It's not just something happening here in the UK, it's happening right around the world. So for the left, the focus should be less, I'm arguing again as somebody who teaches, writes about, gets paid for doing public law, constitutional law, I'm arguing that the left, if we're serious about socialist transformation, and if we're serious about what Michael Lebowitz calls the socialist imperative of empowering working class people to transform the world, because nothing else will do at the moment. No half measures are adequate to the challenges we face now in terms of the rise of the right, the climate crisis, growing inequality. Nothing less than radical, ambitious change should be the focus of our agenda. And if that's what we're concerned with, fulfilling and living up to this socialist imperative, then we should be looking at prefiguring the sort of constitutional architecture we want to see for a fundamentally transformed society, rather than putting all of our eggs into the basket of liberal constitutional reform. So I'll leave it at that for the minute.
That sorted that then. Okay. We'll throw it open to questions and comments. Yeah?
I just want to say, I wonder if people won't get it if it's not immediate enough to our huge current problems. I mean, I haven't got over grief. I'm absolutely shattered that if Labour had got back, we would have revoked the Health and Social Care Act. And I think that these immediate things where the government now cannot be held responsible, and people haven't got it, they don't understand it, the government hide and make it seem as if it still can be held to account when that responsibility has been stripped away. These immediate things are so immediate. How can one help people to get these simple things? And also climate change. Because people's right to a future. So I better stop.
Pass it on.
I have a question about something which might be happening constitutionally, which is the boundary change. The proposals for the boundary reform seem heavily favouring the Conservative Party. You might call it gerrymandering. Because the Labour Party are smaller in number and therefore unable to get things through in terms of vote, what means do we have to question or oppose the proposed boundary review?
Okay, do you want to pass it along over here? The irony about the boundary changes is that now that they've won certain seats that they never expected to win, they might be abolished. Think about that.
I just wanted to bring up the West Lothian question and wonder what the panel think. If to truly democratise the UK, do we need an English Parliament?
When are Labour going to implement a voting system which actually takes account of how people vote, rather than giving the Tories untrammelled power on 43% of the vote?
Okay, pass it on. We'll take half a dozen, then we'll come back to them. No, I think you just have to hold it.
Yeah, I would just like to ask the question about Scotland and the British Labour Party. The Scots seem to have very good sense in making great step forward in constitutional change, but the British Labour Party seems to cling on to the British establishment in denying the Scottish people their full rights. The British Labour Party have dropped such a clanger and they deserve to lose in Scotland. What's been seen over the last 20, 30 years is the feeling that amongst the Scottish people, a progressive feeling, not the opposite, while the British Labour Party has been forming a joint bloc with the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. The Scottish people have been saying, no, we don't want any more of this rule by this establishment. We want a say ourselves. And so it seems to me that the British Labour Party has to change its direction on the whole question of Scottish independence, and until it does, it's going to lose again.
Just in front of you.
Yes, on that topic of the election, which somebody was mentioning a little earlier, just before the election, I heard a representative of the Electoral Commission saying how easy it was to register. You just go online. It seemed utterly unprepared to recognise lots of people were homeless, lots of people had chaotic lives. There's no chance they could have gone online to register. So surely we should reflect on how many, many people actually didn't have a chance even to vote.
Is that all right, Jack?
There's not really a question, but there was something that came as a common thread between the speakers, particularly yourself, sir, and I know John already, and yourself, about the way that you're talking about a citizens' assembly, basically, and the climate situation, as John's very, very well with. These are the things that Extinction Rebellion are talking about. And it's really, the things I'm hearing are basically proof positive of where we should be going, perhaps. I don't know.
I want a Scottish voice. Lynn, are you there? You're indicating. Okay, we'll bring her around and then come round. Is there democratising the use of the microphone? But Marjorie, don't go on too long. Sorry, we're old friends.
My question is, we have just come out of the most toxic, horrendous election that I have ever witnessed in my lifetime. And it's been based on another toxic referendum. How do we get true democracy when citizens are not being fed true facts, inadequate facts, and distorted facts? This is where my problem is with how to get a true democracy.
So you're a member of my constituency party. Is it Heather?
Thank you. First Paul referred to economic democracy. Second Paul referred to South Africa, where Nelson Mandela gave the vote and democracy at a level, but he forgot to do the democratic economic democracy. If we don't take control of our natural resources and natural resource wealth, we can never have true democracy in this country, particularly on the economics. Over 50% of wealth in this country is held in land. Over 50% of adults don't have any access to that land wealth because they're either tenants or living with family, parents, etc., and that number's increasing, particularly amongst young people. HS1, HS2, all our public services, our buses, etc., add to land values, create land values. And that land wealth we have got to take under democratic control. I would say all natural resources should be held in common and we pay the economic rent for whatever we want to use as individuals or businesses or institutions, but at least charge the economic rent through land value capture and those sorts of things. If we're going to have real democracy, we've got to challenge the economy as well. Thank you.
Jackie, you all right? Sorry about this. I'll do that if you want. Do you want to come in? I just want to get the Scottish words first.
Oh yeah, I was trying to pose it too.
All right, thanks. Yeah, what we're going to say about Scotland. Well, I'm afraid I think that in some ways we've got a much more progressive government in Scotland because we have an AMS system. I work for the Electoral Reform Society, so I'm going to say that. But also, I mean, I do agree with your point that these kind of structural reforms are not enough, and these prefigurations are important. While I think you do need to reform the state because the prefiguration can be made more or less possible by the structure of the kind of state above it. In fact, the work that ERS is doing in Scotland is about trying to institutionalise citizens' assemblies within local government there, which is a way of prefiguring it. So I guess, you know, and that's not something that's something that the Scottish government is actually allowing. So that's institutionalising these new forms of democracy. I guess one of my points was, like, where are these prefigurations going to happen? Because they're not happening in the Labour Party. The Labour Party is a hierarchy. It's you know, it has all these problems of those sort of power structures. It's not happening in the trade unions where it might. So where are these prefigurations going to happen? I mean, I suggest they should be in local government, but that's best allowed by a state that is restructured as well, I think.
Shall I get the panel to come back and we'll come back again, yeah? Okay, Paul?
No,
Whichever.
Okay. We can see from the range of contributions there are some real conundrums here, and real intellectual challenges as well. Because if the movement's been used to working within the state apparatus and the state power system since its inception in 1900, and I never forget the photograph of the first minority Labour government taken in Downing Street, and we're all sitting there in frock coats and top hats. They didn't take long to incorporate them into the system of state power. So it's a very seductive thing, and we're born into this state. Everything is regulated by the state, and it's very difficult to conceive of anything else but this state. But we have to. This is the point. It is a state which lacks capacity and has turned really from a welfare state, in my view, into a market state, and really just facilitates the work of the transnationals. That's all it does, essentially. And therefore, the state has lost its raison d'etre and its purpose and its ability to say, we speak for the people in common. They don't. I think people sense that. That's why people didn't vote. You know, the turnout of the last election was down. It was actually down in England. It was up in Scotland, but it was down in England. You know, a third of the population doesn't believe that this political system has anything for it. And we should acknowledge that. And no amount of, you know, messing around with that will encourage people to return their allegiance. So the state has lost this support. And that, I think, is a very good thing we could build on. We can build on, and I agree with this prefiguring, other forms of democracy. Citizens' assemblies, not as advisory bodies to central and local government who then just park it in some filing cabinet somewhere, but actually beginning to exercise some independent sense of their own power. Actually, and I see our convention is in that spirit. It's about involving the people themselves in determining what they want their future to be, and it's extremely important for this transformation project that Paul talked about. And unless they're committed to that and see a vision of that, they're not going to come along with it. So yeah, we have to do that. Citizens' assemblies, I agree with the Extinction Rebellion. I'm also angry the assembly that has been set up to investigate the climate crisis carries no power whatsoever. It's a toothless body. So we have to take that opening and create, working on South Tyneside in a small way, to create something independent of local government structures, independent of state structures, to think about how eventually these assemblies could become the basis of a new forms of governance in the country. Is that not possible? Are we just fixated on Parliament and the House of Lords and the Exchequer and all these things, all these departments? Or can we think of something? Can we conceive of something else? A project we have to really start to delve into in a serious research-based way in order to inspire people, like the Chartists inspire people, like the Levellers inspired people, like the suffragettes inspired, that kind of inspiration for a new democratic settlement. And to recapture this concept of democracy it's been appropriated by the ruling classes. It's nothing to do with them. We had to wrest it from them after all. Let's not be ashamed to use it. Too long the left has, democracy, that's for them. They talk about that, it's their democracy. Well, it's actually our democracy too. It's a contested area, and we must contest it in a more vigorous way than we have been doing.
I have to take issue, I think, with the idea that Scotland is more progressive. It's hard to be less progressive, I have to accept that, but there's nothing innate, I would say, in Scotland that makes it more progressive. It's a movement that was built out of the trade union movement that created that progressiveness. It didn't come from blood or whiskey or any of the other things. And I think when we look at the current Scottish Parliament, we have to ask what it's doing to help our democracy grow. It's destroying the very root of our democracy in local government. It's actually depriving it of resources. It's depriving it of any possibility of thinking out of the box. We have no Preston model in Scotland. We have Joe Cullinane in North Ayrshire. I could just, I could just hear that, him calling me to say, don't forget North Ayrshire. But without any resources to work on, that the Scottish government is depriving them of. It's not Westminster. They are actually passing on greater cuts to local government than they are receiving in their budget from the UK government. So I would argue that, of course, Scotland has the right to self-determination. And John comes up to Scotland from time to time and creates a hell of a fuss by saying things like that. But it is, I think it's understood there is a right. It's how often that right should be exercised and how that comes about that I think might be open to debate. We had a referendum and the outcome wasn't what obviously a lot of independent supporters wanted. And from literally 3 days later, the campaign started for another referendum. I don't want to live my life in a state that is just going from bouncing along from one referendum to another and not tackling the huge issues we have in Scotland around healthcare, education. Our economy is wrecked. it's not owned in Scotland, it's not controlled in Scotland. We have no possibility of democratising our economy until we can get hold of it. Land, one of the issues that you would have expected a Scottish National Party to really make significant changes on. They've tinkered, they've delivered nothing. So they've hidden behind the excuse of the European Union up to now. So we'll see what happens when they have to make real choices on some of these issues. So I think what we need, not so much a citizens' assemblies, is movements of people, and particularly, I think, through the trade unions and other bodies that have really become very tame and compliant over the years. Hopefully we've got an opportunity now to work with some of the new unions, the growing unions, the exciting unions. Some are affiliated to the party, some are not. In Scotland, we've got a new General Secretary of our STUC, our Scottish Trade Union Congress. I understand Wales has now got a new acting secretary. I look to them to help lead us in a movement for change that goes beyond sitting in rooms and citizens' assemblies and is on the streets.
Thanks very much. And just a lot of excellent questions, and I'll try and address some of the points that come up. The urgency of the matter, you're right, and the problem is it's always urgent, and it's been urgent for the last 30 years in different ways. But there's a balance to be struck there as well. There's a famous story about how at the outbreak of World War I, Lenin went away to a library in Switzerland and read Hegel for about 6 months in order to reorientate his understanding of capitalism, the nature of it. So you're right that there's urgency, but we also have to learn from recent mistakes in the general election, recent mistakes in how Labour approached the question of Brexit, recent mistakes in how the left more broadly relates to the working class, relates to the trade union. We have to learn those lessons, otherwise we'll urgently make the same mistakes again. We're probably almost certainly looking at least 10 years of this Tory government on the basis of what happened after the last election. The Fabian Society published a report looking at the sort of calculus of what Labour would have to do at the next elections, the likelihood or otherwise, and it seems unlikely. So if we've got 10 years of this Tory government, which means we have about 20 years of Tory government by the time they're done, now's the time for us to urgently rethink what we've been doing and to urgently learn the lessons to then build the alternative we want to see going forward.
Except that where will the emissions be in 10 or 20 years?
We don't know. We don't know.
Very likely to be more and more on fire.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
it's more real.
Oh yeah. Sorry. That doesn't mean we stop political activism, but that means we do also take this moment.
But focus on
the
emissions
yeah.
rising.
I mean, that's one part of it. And again, the Tories will obviously have an attitude to that. But the Tories' attitude to emissions is related to the broader character of capitalism as such. So capitalism is a system of short-term logic. There's no idea of thinking about emissions in 10 years. You think about the next quarter and the valorisation of capital over a 3-month period. You don't think about what will the environment look like in 5, 10, 15 years.
Almost every time that anybody said anything, they said, and climate change.
Yeah.
Just the way he said, and Brexit, do Brexit. We just said, and climate change.
Yeah.
Because, excuse me.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry. So just on that point, I just say that you're right, it is urgent, but there's a whole range of other urgent issues, and one of them is, and I think John should be congratulated for initiating this series of seminars, because one of the on Scotland, I won't, as an Irishman, dare comment on our cousins up the road and what they're doing. I will say I do agree with Pauline, and I think that's another issue about how we as socialists think about politics. I think it's about how we as socialists think about politics. The SNP, fundamentally, it's a bourgeois nationalist party. So they're never going to lead the sort of social transformation that socialists are in. Likewise in Ireland, Sinn Féin have over the years morphed into a bourgeois nationalist party, and if they do end up forming government, it won't be this radical transformative project. It'll be an accommodation with capital. It'll be implementing some modest reforms, and that's what the SNP have done in Scotland. There's groups in Scotland doing fantastic work. The Radical Independence Campaign, RIC, when they were around, Conter, Rose, a lot of different groups. So I won't comment that. On this question of economic democracy, you're right, and I'm sorry I had to very quickly gloss over this, but in South Africa, one of the preconditions for the peaceful abolition of apartheid South Africa was that the ANC abandoned the Freedom Charter, and the Freedom Charter was a sophisticated document about public ownership and common ownership of property, and the main concession the ANC had to make was to surrender any illusions of actually transforming the power relations in South Africa in order to have formal equality, which again is a massive achievement, but it's far short of what we as socialists should be looking for and should be interested in. Where are the prefigurations going to happen? I'm tempted to cop out and say that we shouldn't try and sort of write cookbooks for the kitchens of the future, that's not our job. But actually I think the prefigurations are there already. So the Preston model is one example. Again, it's embryonic, it's limited, it's got problems. There was one instance of participatory budgeting in the UK that I know of, which was a Tory council in Newcastle, which gave its residents the choice over which service was to be cut. So it can be co-opted by the right as well. It's not some sort of abstract good in its own right. But again, I think you're right, and this is for people in Labour to comment on what Labour will or won't do, but the left and the Labour movement is bigger than the Labour Party, and so prefigurations will be within Labour itself, but also beyond it, and I think that we all have to be part of it. Antonio Machado has this lovely phrase that we build the road by walking it. So we can't say in advance exactly what it will look like, but if we have an orientation which says that it's about empowering working class people to be the protagonistic, active decision makers in their own lives, that can then shape what we're doing. Community councils deciding about transport and questions around climate and so forth. So there's a whole range of things we could do. And just finally, because again I think it's important, again, very brief, all of us here have tried to cover an awful lot of ground in a short space of time. And I want to say, while I've argued for an orientation which prioritises these prefigurative practices, I'm not saying that we ignore the extant state apparatus. We have to engage with that as well. But we have to engage with it with a socialist understanding of the nature of the state. We can't engage with it under the illusion that it's a neutral apparatus we can lay hold to. We can tweak it and twist it and it'll turn out a little better at the end. And I think that's really important. We have to think that through. And that's about how we as socialists understand the nature of this society. And it's one of the things that for me, when I see people talk about, let's say for example, simply reforming the European Union and so forth, it shows a lack of understanding of the nature of state power. It shows a lack of understanding of the nature of the constitutional architecture of that and how that operates. Interesting, when we talk about written constitutions, they were, at a point in time, a radical progressive force. Written constitutions placed constraints on previously absolute monarchs, demarcated spaces for democratic participation for the ascendant bourgeoisie. But in the last 30 years, through a process which is referred to as new constitutionalism, written constitutional documents have been used mainly to lock in the political gains of the capitalist class, have been used mainly to constitutionalize what Roberto Unger calls the dictatorship of no alternatives. It's similar in a way to when the Romans would defeat an enemy in the past and they'd salt the earth so nothing would grow after it. So Labour was defeated when the miners were defeated. Public sector workers in France were defeated. In the US, the air traffic controllers were defeated. After that, through the treaties of the European Union, through constitutional reforms in South Africa, in Canada and so forth, those political victories were locked in by the constitutional arrangements. So when we approach the question of constitutional reform, when we approach the question of legal forms, we have to come at it as socialists. We have to come at it ruthlessly and realistically and ask ourselves, how does this advance our overall objective of the self-emancipation of the working class? That's what I'm arguing, and that covers the whole gamut of existing state institutions and prefigurative practice.
Yeah, there's a whole series of I'm trying to distribute geographically as well. 10. Oh God, we'll occupy. If we're really quick, and then we can pass it around quickly. Okay.
I'll be like grease lightning, promise. This is very interesting, and I'm not going to repeat any of the comments that have already been made, but I just want to make two things. just to make two comments. Firstly, I found a lot of this discussion rather abstract. And although, I mean, the last speaker is very eloquent in terms of, you know, a future that we might envisage, in practical terms, I think it's going to fall, if not on deaf ears, just on stony ground for the majority of the population. And so I'd just like to mention two things very quickly. One is not so abstract because we've just seen examples of it, which is the royal prerogative. And although Boris Johnson's attempt to close down Parliament for a long period was deemed unconstitutional and illegal, it nonetheless strikes me as quite extraordinary that after the Civil War, when we're supposed to have got rid of a king by chopping off his head, that this extraordinary power is retained in the Prime Minister through the monarch. And it seems to me that we have to get rid of that because given the fact that we've accepted that there are five-year parliamentary terms maximum, then it should only be Parliament that can prorogue itself. And I think this is something which fundamentally we need to look after. Now, one very quick thing about the practicalities. I'm one of the people in the room who's run a couple of organisations of quite considerable size, one in Canada and one here. And I ran them, and I was much mocked at first by some of the publications, more or less on Spanish anarchist lines, as the anarchist movement worked before the Spanish Civil War. And that was empowering all the people who worked in it to make their own decisions, with myself as a kind of flak catcher, that's an American term, to deal with problems. And the extraordinary thing about that was that although we live in a capitalist society, it actually worked. And I had to persuade people to go on holiday because they were working too hard. So we can do it in small ways if we try in organisations in which we work.
Thanks.
So just a couple of observations. So I think local government's come up a couple of times this evening from a couple of speakers. So I think from my viewpoint, it seems that the Corbyn project has sort of barely touched local government. There's been no perceptible Labour swing at the ground level. We've got, in a lot of cases, powerful elected mayors who are acting against local communities. And we have a stitched up cabinet system where they can appoint people into positions of power. So that then creates this incoherence where we have Labour being anti-austerity, but being forced to implement austerity at the council level. So I think that's been a major factor in how the general public have perceived the party. And just another point in terms of bankruptcy and democracy, worth pointing out that when Carillion went bankrupt a couple of years ago, we had immediate inquiries into both Carillion, the company, and KPMG, the auditor. But when we look at Northamptonshire County Council, a Tory-run council that went bankrupt, there was no inquiry into either the council or to the auditor, KPMG. So why is it there's more democracy in financial markets than there are in local government?
Okay. Can you move it forward? If you move it forward a bit.
I think these seminars are incredibly important because we don't do enough teaching. I mean, you know, Tony Benn was the inspiration for this movement, and he was, you know, he brought people an understanding of what you can do, what the working class can do with their efforts and their sacrifice to change the British constitutional arrangements. And yet so few people understand who the Chartists were, who the Levellers were, what a trade union is, how trade unions brought about the weekend, the 7-hour day. We don't do enough teaching the Labour Party, and it's, to be honest with you, it's our own fault when we then go on the doorstep and people say, we're not going to vote for you because the council has effectively done what they think that the council has done, what the Conservatives have actually applied at government level. And we really have to have more seminars like these. And also at CLP level, we need to start educating our members about the gains that the Labour movement has made, how that's affected the Constitution, and how that allows us to be more confident about what we can achieve going forward. Because unless we do that, as Tony Benn said, unless you educate people, unless you tell people what's happening, they simply don't understand what's happening, and you're never going to be able to change their minds about what you can do in the future. So.
Okay, I'd reiterate what's just been said about teaching, not merely within the Labour Party, but certainly teaching some of our Labour MPs better economics, and starting at the age of 5 with circle time. We need to not just put systems in place, but I go along with Paul O'Connell's criticism. We need to upskill ourselves by enabling people. I mean, maybe you should give votes to everybody who can do Key Stage 2 maths, percentages, and so forth, and have millennials teaching the rest of the population about behavioural engineering on the internet, more public speaking in state schools. Also, the costs for engaging in democracy. The majority of us here do not have kids to look after. The sort of bandwidth which ordinary people have to engage in democracy. Personally, I've had more fun times not at political meetings than otherwise, and if people don't think that there's going to be any particular payoffs, they will neither engage and they won't feel they can engage until there is more understanding of how systems work and so on. So maybe more school pupils or school governors, that kind of thing. But finally, a systems change, I would prefer. I think we would all agree we ought to have a second referendum. And of course, I'm referring to the 2011 second referendum, where we have either alternative vote or single transferable vote, because that's way the ordinary punter is transmitting more information across to politicians than the basic binary we've got. And yeah, finally, more multi-layer democracy, citizens' assemblies up.
Can you pass it on quickly? Just take a few more, I'll come over.
We seem to be avoiding, it's just very, just glimpsed at the end there, we're avoiding the discussion on PR. And I think that's quite a sensitive issue in Labour. I feel that, like, constituency MPs are great because obviously it's a very direct parliamentary connection. And a second, you know, turning the House of Lords into a second House elected would be great, but you're still going to have the outcome of the sitting government, you know, a right-wing party with a minority, 42%, having a majority government. Is it now time to really seriously talk about PR?
To just pass it on.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Clive Lewis was talking about working with other parties as well, like the Green Party, and I can't see from what I've read that how Labour can just go on like this and just win again in the normal, you know, sort of ways. So one thing that happened over the election, people haven't talked about much, but my experience was that with the Lib Dems and how, you know, they were lying, and then they were. And I was going to Kensington and Wimbledon places, and they were saying they were second. They'd lied on leaflets, and it was acknowledged on Newsnight. And then we lost by 150 votes in Kensington when they got like 4,000 less or something. And that happened in quite a lot of places. And I think that Labour needed to try and work with the Lib Dems, not actually, you know, but just say, look, you have these seats, and then leave us alone in those, you know, on that level, because that's, you know, they seem to every election do that. And then Simon Jenkins actually said in The Guardian, you know, like, you've done it again, why don't you just forget yourselves? But what The Guardian actually did was 3 weeks before, with that rabbi, they had all these articles in there about, you know, going on about how Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic. Then they'd done it to death. Then The Observer had another article, and then that week following, they were saying, a week before the election, vote Labour. You know, and then they've had a string of articles in The Guardian about Labour and how it's declining and how it's this and how it's that, and they're all really interesting. And we're getting our information from The Guardian, from all these papers, but we don't discuss much inside. And just at our local meetings, over Brexit, we'd had no discussions, except for one thing where we were 2 minutes we were allowed each, and we weren't allowed to discuss it. So the only discussion is around when someone has a motion. And that just means that we don't really discuss, because only certain people have motions and stuff. And that was the same over anti-Semitism, and it was the same over whether we should actually go into the election. So I think a lot more talking in Labour would really help as well.
Don't get us going on The Guardian, for God's sake.
Hi, I'd just like to say, as in the experience of having been a candidate in the last election, that
a lot of what was focused on was how we weren't a democratic party. And I think if we're going to focus on changing the democratic structures in society, I think we have to look at what's important to the people. The people don't care about democracy unless they think that it's being stolen from them. So what we need to actually do is have a more participatory politics where people feel part of the actual structure that we have. When you get people on board with the system that you have, then you can try to reform what there is to reform. I think going back just to what you said about citizens' assemblies, I think citizens' assemblies are a really privileged structure. They exclude the people who cannot participate in that process, which are the underprivileged, people who cannot access, people don't have a lot of spare time, people working 2-3 jobs, people who can't afford to access things. We have the structures there, we have to make them work, so we need to make our unions stronger, we need to make our local councillors more accountable, and we also need to make the party more accountable to its members.
I just wanted to put a socialist word in for written constitutions, and from a class point of view, because if you think about the nature of our non-constitution and its flexibility, it's been it's not some accident. It's the product of the way what the ruling class needs and what the empire needed. It needed to run that empire. It needed immense flexibility. And we know from the trade union movement, and I know from the women's movement, when we had a long critique of the tyranny of structurelessness, that rules, publicly, explicitly laid down and developed, democratically decided rules, are crucial to working class power. And that actually we need those rules, I don't fetishize them, I completely agree with you. I think of them in terms of the class origins of our existing flexible, monarchical system. And unless we do develop an alternative that includes rules but has got a kind of movement base, then, we're fucked, really. I mean, look at Johnson. He thrives on flexibility. That's what he's building his power on. And just finally on South Africa, which is I think it's an example not to be dropped because of the ANC. I mean, the ANC, the reason why the capital's power is built into the system is not because of the Constitution. It's because of the ANC and the ditching of the Freedom Charter and the behaviour of the ANC, and that actually the Constitution was a democratic moment, and it was a non-liberal Constitution. It was specifically not about restraining the state. It was about empowering working class people to demand their goals, so that actually the one important sphere of struggle there has been working class people, poor people, homeless people, demanding and organising for their rights that are in the Constitution. So I just think we should look at that Constitution slightly separate from the nature of the ANC. It can't solve the problem, and South Africa proves that, but it is an important part of a genuinely left transformative process.
Let's zip through these contributions quickly, yeah?
You're not going to get a chance to ask.
We will, don't worry. Alan, and then we'll get a couple more, then that's it.
John, I just think it would be a disaster for Labour to concede the next election because of something that you spotted before anyone, and that is that in the first of the working groups you set up in relation to climate change, you came out saying that climate physics is in the driving seat now, much more than political convenience. And that hasn't been understood in the shadow cabinet, and it is understood outside in Extinction Rebellion. But even in XR, the discussion we're now having is whether that whole idea of citizens' assemblies actually failed to reach the poor in any meaningful and inclusive way. And where we have to start is the notion that physics tells us what we do in the current decade will determine whether we've got an economics to be working within, or whether we're just lurching from one ecological catastrophe to another. The second is that if you want to avoid that, you're going to have to rebuild from the base. It is about inclusive democracy that is led from the centre but owned from the local. And in a way, the tragedy for me about where Labour ended up is we ended up in a confusion around the argument about Green Industrial Revolution or Green New Deal. The growth is off the agenda if we want to survive. Redistribution and food security, housing security, whether we can heat our homes, whether we can access public transport, all of these, in sustainable terms, are the agenda that will define what happens within this decade. Whoever's in power, those are the crises. So my question is not actually to the panel, because there was only one mention in the opening comments about climate. My question is really to you. You, as the only person who grasped this properly in the current Parliamentary Labour Party, will you actually lead the renewal from the base that is actually called for as part of the rewriting, the fundamental rewriting of climate economics that will have to be delivered within the next 5 years if we want to survive the next 10?
The last person is the young woman on the end there. So thanks, sir.
Hey, thank you. Sorry, just bear with me a second. I've just been really interested in everything that everybody said tonight. Somebody before mentioned that it was abstract, and it leads me on to my question. I'm probably tell from Carlisle from the north, so I'm quite a long way from home. Many of the towns and cities, as you know, it was a disastrous general election result for us. We also largely voted to leave the EU, but I think this was an anti-establishment vote rather than anything else. A lot of what you said tonight I completely agree with, but how do we get this across to everyday man on the street? You've said that we need to, this has to be about the working class. That change isn't going to happen without us, but if we're just continually talking in echo chambers, and I appreciate that we all do need to get together to talk about these things, how are you going to break this down? Because the one thing the Tories did get right was that message this time in the general election. It was simple, it was clear, and it spoke to people, and these people have lived in places that have declined, not only because of Tory austerity, but during Labour governments as well.
Thanks, sir. I'm just going Sorry about this. This is what happens. It could go on all night, and the staff want to get home. I'm sorry. I apologise to them. We're going to do 2 minutes each, and that's it. Okay. What?
Got till 8:30, we understand.
No, it's no. 8 o'clock. Okay. Don't worry.
2 minutes. That's even better than 10 minutes. So very quickly, abstract followed up by a reference to the prerogative. Haven't taught prerogative power to UK public law students for the last 10 years. That's far more abstract for them, certainly until recent Brexit-related developments. The point that the comrade made over there is crucial. Democracy and empowering people isn't an abstraction. It's about people's concrete lived experiences. And I was out canvassing for Laura Smith, who unfortunately lost her seat in Crewe, and other MPs in Lee and Bolton and so forth. And Paul mentioned the decline in the vote in the last general election, which has actually been a sort of secular trend across Western democracies for the last 30 years. But there was a massive increase in the vote around the referendum, the Brexit referendum. Lots of people who hadn't voted before voted for the first time. They had a say on a crucial issue of national policy, and then the vast majority of the political class told them they were wrong. And I think that wasn't an abstraction for anyone. When you were talking to people on the doorstep, they understood it. They understood the disrespect that entailed. They understood the rejection of their agency that entailed. None of this is to say that the Tories aren't nasty, unpleasant, right-wing people who will pursue a horrendous set of policies, but they do that anyway, and we knew that anyway. This isn't a surprise for anyone, you know what I mean? So that question about democracy, it isn't an abstraction, and it relates to the comrade's point about education. I think you're right. The lack of political education is a serious concern on the left in general, but education, I think, has to be understood as broader than talks and publications and so forth. Education is concrete practice as well. People will learn a lesson far better and far more intimately through struggle, through practice. That's what the trade union movement has taught us for years. That's why you had conversations with those family members or those workmates who were a little bit racist or a little bit sexist. You didn't dismiss them as fascists. You spoke to them on the picket line. When I used to be a scaffolder, and when the Polish first started coming to Ireland, and people would say, "Oh, Polish coming over here taking our jobs," and you say, "Have you spoken to them? Have you asked them to join the union? You have more in common with them than you have with Dennis O'Brien, multi-billionaire Irish tax dodger." No, so you have these conversations, and that's where education comes into it. On constitution, so I think why the UK doesn't have a constitution. Partly, yes, because of the requirements of the British ruling class, also because of historical accident. So generally you get a written constitution after a big political shake-up, and the last big political shake-up here was the Civil War, which predated the emergence of the written constitution as the standard form of constitutional democracy. So it was the French Revolution which led the way on that, the American War of Independence. The American Empire does quite well with a written constitution. So I don't think having flexibility or not having flexibility is the key thing there. I also think with South Africa, if you look at Abahlalia Basemajondo, who won the most active social movements in South Africa, they have a healthy disdain for the constitution. They understand that there's a functional role it can play, but they understand that their struggle is in mobilising on the streets and educating the shack dwellers and so forth. So I just don't think there's an argument against a written constitution in and of itself, but I don't think it should be a priority. It doesn't seem to me that the biggest problems facing the left in Britain today are because of the existing constitutional architecture. Actually, quite the contrary. John Griffith, who was one of the few socialist public lawyers, once said, the constitution is what happens day to day, and if nothing happens, that'd be constitutional too. And the thing is if we win the battles on the political terrain, there's far greater scope for a Labour government, for example, to implement a serious policy of nationalisation, of reorganisation of the economy, than there would be in a constitutional system which had a right to property enshrined in it. So, famous example, Jawaharlal Nehru, following independence in India, wanted to pursue a whole range of redistributive policies and was prevented from doing so by the Supreme Court protecting the right to property. So there's a balance to be struck there. I'll leave it at that.
I won't take my 2 minutes because what I want to say, I think, is really encapsulated by the last question, which was about the vote on Brexit being an anti-establishment vote. The vote for the SNP in Scotland was an anti-establishment vote. The vote for Sinn Féin in Ireland was an anti-establishment vote. Unfortunately, these are not the votes that are going to result in change. But anti-establishmentarianism doesn't go back in the box when that mood passes. It's there. And we, as a labour movement, have to become part of the anti-establishment, not the establishment. And that, I think, is, to me, touches on so many questions that have come up today. So thank you for inviting me along here. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, there's an appetite for change. This is a very big meeting, and the biggest meeting that I've been at for some time discussing these kinds of questions. So I think we should take some encouragement from the turnout here for a start, and thanks for organising it, John. It's very important. I think to the person who said it's an abstraction, well, these are abstractions, but our job is to make them concrete abstractions with practices and to make them mean something to people. And that isn't easy when you're dealing with abstractions like the state, democracy and constitution. It is a challenge. So let's just dig down and make these abstractions concrete and meaningful to people. You know, the Levellers were involved in a struggle for a constitution, and they were, you know, not the political class. It is possible, the Chartists as well, and the suffragettes. It is possible, and we must have faith that citizens, people, privileged or not privileged, can take part in developing these ideas. We have to have it. It's not something for the political class to do, because it won't succeed if that's what it's left to. It just won't succeed like that. To the same person who said the royal prerogative is a problem, yeah, abolish it. First of all, we abolish the monarchy, then you abolish the royal prerogative. It's as simple as that. On the question of local government democracy, I would ask, where is it? I would ask, where is it? Unfortunately, it's centralised power, and I have to say local councils have become the tool of Westminster for too long. And they are held in some disrespect by local communities. And Citizens' Assembly is not about privilege. The one I'm working with in South Tyneside are ordinary people coming together to challenge the local authority and to develop an independent set of policies that they will campaign for. And it's not a privileged group of people, I can tell you that from nothing. So I would say that finally, you know, we have it's not, we have a constitution here, it's uncodified. It is written down in various places, many acts of parliament. And I think Graham Allen, the former chair of the Select Committee on the Constitution in the previous Parliament 1, actually engaged King's College to produce a written unified version of this constitution. It's possible to see it all together, but it makes no difference. The point is, the constitution we have is broken, and it doesn't work for the people, and that's what we have to get across. So I would say that, you know, my final appeal is for support these ideas of conventions. Take this idea out of changing the constitution into communities, really, and do this education about our own history. You know, we are standing in the struggles of going back to Wat Tyler, to the 14th century, let alone the Levellers and others. So it's a long tradition of the struggle for democracy here. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Let's pick it up again.
Thanks. Can I thank the panel and just say thanks for coming as well. Just very, very briefly, look, no one said the construction of a socialist society would be easy. And the whole strategy that we've tried to pursue throughout our movement is to seize the opportunities when they come along. And it is based upon the balance of forces within society itself. And sometimes you'll move forward a bit and sometimes you'll be pushed back. And on different occasions, it's interesting, the creativity within our movement is to look at what institutional forms can take us forward and those ones that need to evolve differently. So that's how we formed the trade union movement. That's how we formed a political party. That's why we went into local government. That's why in the 80s, there's people here who are part of that movement, Hillary, Bryn Davis and others. In the GLC, we were, this is archaeology, I know, but our theory was in and against the state. It was the state as a set of institutions, but it's a relationship of dominance as well. We went inside the institutions to change that relationship. That's why they abolished us, because we were becoming relatively successful in changing that relationship. The whole point about Jeremy Corbyn winning the leadership of the Labour Party was to try and transform the Labour Party in a much more democratic, mass, no longer a traditional Labour Party, but a social movement. And we've moved some distance towards that. But, of course, the overwhelming power that we're up against came and ensured that we never won that election, and they did it through the usual traditional moves. Often we've seen the Zinoviev letter, but we know with smears and all the rest, use of the media, etc. And you just learn that lesson, and you know you move forward each time, and there'll be pushback, of course. So what we're doing now is what are the lessons that we have to learn now, and the issue around communication is one that's absolutely key. So on March the 5th, we've got. How do we win the argument? How do we move out there? And all that stuff. And some of the stuff that we were doing, the community wealth building came from the original discussions around the GLC itself. What we've been doing for my Treasury team, we've been touring around the country every other Saturday, bringing people together to talk about their local economy. What we didn't have was the next resource to hold those people together, to then move into developing local communities, prospectuses, etc. And that was part of the internal battles that we had within the Labour Party to get our hands on resources, and the various coups that were going on at the time, all enjoyable at the time, obviously, and interesting. But that's part of the process of moving forward and then being pushed back and then moving forward again. So the idea around issues around written constitutions and changes in our structure into federalism or whatever is whether or not it's of any value in moving forward the struggle that we're on to attain that socialist society that we want to create. And tactically at the moment there are a number of areas that we can move into. The abolition of the House of Lords is a key issue, because if we can get an elected Senate, but it's probably on proportional representation of some form, it will help free us up and have a little more flexibility in Parliament itself. The abolition of the royal prerogative. All of those are small tactical considerations of the movement forward, but it's only as a result of the reflection of the sort of society that we want to create and what weapons that we can use or tools that we can use to create that society. So yes, on occasions we'll resort to law, on other occasions we'll resort to democratic engagement, on other occasions we'll resort to the picket line demonstration occupations. And that's the sort of movement we've got to be. But the key issue is the one that was raised over here by the young man over here, which is, for God's sake, we keep on reinventing things because we've not had the political education within our movement that we should have had. And the World Transform movement that we have now, if people don't know about it, get involved. Because I think it's one of the best initiatives that's happened in recent years. The World Transformed is all about bringing people together to talk about the nature of society, how you transform it, but also building in the political education and history of our movement to understand what did work then, what might work now, or what newly needs to be invented. And I think whatever you thought about the general election, yes, it was a devastating defeat and all the rest, but actually to go into an election with a relatively socialist manifesto was a huge advance for the movement. And it's quite interesting, none of the leadership candidates at the moment are talking about resigning from that programme. And so, again, it's another movement forward. I'm not trying to be over-optimistic here. I'm just saying don't underestimate the advances that we've made by using different tactical arrangements. Part of the tactical arrangements that we need to move forward on as well is this debate around democratic reform, because actually one of the things that came up in the discussion today, unless we can get back to some form of basic democracy at the very local level, and maybe extract that into the regions and also the nations, again, we've lost an element of the power base that we could use. Anyway, that's me rounding off. Thanks for coming tonight. Really grateful.